I forgot to throw away my 3D swag. I'm never doing that again. Pacific Rim tells the tale of monsters invading Earth from deep beneath the sea. After years of what seemed to be an unwinnable war, the world decides to fight back using Jaegers, or also known as just giant robots. And after years of being out of duty, a young pilot must enter the inside of a Jaeger once again in order to take on the oncoming monstrous onslaught. For some time now, we were given the impression that this movie was a bit of a passion project for director Guillermo del Toro, and it clearly shows throughout the movie that he just loves the idea of giant robots kicking the shit out of giant monsters. And don't get me wrong, who doesn't? But what separates Del Toro apart from other directors that will take on this kind of material, like, for example, I don't know, a certain director whose name rhymes with Psycho K, is that he doesn't take the material and makes a dumb, unintelligent film that is meant to, to have you turn off your brain and just enjoy the ride. No, he takes the material and turns to you and says, with its action sequences and with its splendor, hey, remember that time when you were a kid and you would take your toy monster and your toy robot and, put them up against each other and just pretend that they're fighting and pretend that they're having this epic battle upon the city, and then Power Rangers will come on and that would infuse you to play with your toys even more, and then you would watch Godzilla and that would make you want to play with the toys even more and make you enjoy more of your childhood. That's what Del Toro is saying to you with this movie, and he does so by building this mythology as well as this technology within this world that it makes sense. It's not the most realistic form of technology within a science fiction setting like Inception or movies like that, but it's the kind of technology that you look at and you can't help but just marvel at it, and the inner kid inside you goes, man, that looks really cool, I wish that existed. I was on my way home and I was thinking to myself, I want to pilot a Jaeger so bad. I would name mine Dark Spider. That would be its name. My friend who I saw the movie with, she wants to name hers Cinnamon Thunder. Dark Spider and Cinnamon Thunder kicking alien ass together. And the action sequences in this movie are amazing. I mean, what do you expect? It's giant robots going up against giant monsters. And the settings that these action sequences take place are very diversified enough to make you go, okay, I want to see how much they could just tear up this place within their battle. And much like with the tone of this film, it speaks to the inner kid inside you. Every time they did something that you didn't see in the trailer, but you were thinking to yourself, man, it'll be awesome if the Jaeger had this under its weaponry, or if it did this with this certain object. I mean, you saw this in the trailer, so it's not exactly a spoiler, but a robot takes a oil tanker and just uses it as a baseball bat up against a monster. When you see moments like that, and there are, I'm not gonna say several, but there are enough to make you all giddy, you just can't help but just going, cheer in your seat and just be like, this is awesome. My only little complaint about these action sequences is that sometimes it does suffer from what Transformers did, where I'm not going to say that the camera got too close, but just the scale of these battles and the scale of the participants in these battles, which in this case are the Kaiju and the Jaegers, they're just a little bit too big. I mean, the design of these things, both the monsters and the Jaegers alike, are just stupendous. I mean, they're the kind of things that only a kid could dream of. But when, they're just a little too big to where and only film buffs like me are going to recognize this. This movie was shot at a 1.85 to 1 aspect ratio as opposed to the 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio, which is a little bit wider. You got the thicker black bars at the bottom of the top. Here it's a little, more open from top to bottom. But even so, shot at that frame, it's still kind of small in order to fit these Jaegers and the monsters, especially when it's like a 2-on-1 match. And sometimes these battles do get a little close, and tight cornered to where all you see is a limb or all you see is a leg. But fortunately, this does not happen too often, not often like it did with Transformers. And you manage, and by the end of the match, you do know who won, you do know who's getting the upper hand, and you do know who's winning. And in regards to these action sequences, the CGI is amazing. I would be immensely surprised if this does not get nominated for Best Visual Effects by Oscar season. And while we're on the subject of its visual flair, this movie is, even apart from the action sequences, this movie is actually rather beautiful. Guillermo del Toro reunites with his cinematographer Guillermo Navarro, who he shot with the Hellboy movies. And, you can tell he's a bit fond of the blue and yellow color motifs throughout the movie, but he uses them, in favor of the science fiction setting, and it works really well. And lo and behold, a movie with good 3D. If you couldn't tell by the beginning of this review, I saw this movie in 3D, and I honestly can say that the 3D in this movie is rather good. Now, it's not the most amazing 3D, it's not Avatar all over again, but the 3D in this movie is exceptional. You can tell from the get-go that Guillermo del Toro knew that Warner Brothers was going to shove 3D in his face with this movie. I mean, it's giant robots against giant monsters. Why wouldn't it be in 3D? So he's like, okay, since I know that they're going to shove 3D in my face and, force me to make this movie in 3D, I'm going to take advantage of the 3D. So what does he do? He sets almost, if not all of the action sequences in this movie in a setting that involves either rain or snow or dirt and a lot of debris, or some sort of setting that features an awful lot of particle effects and takes those particle effects and flings them at you, and it's used very effectively. I'll tell you this, you know how when you see a movie in 3D and around the 20 or 30 minute mark you kind of get used to the 3D and it becomes invisible and you don't even notice it anymore and it becomes a regular 2D movie. Here, we were in the third act, and I was still seeing some depth of field when it came to, looking down a particular hallway. And during the climax, which, I'm not going to give too much away, but let's just say it takes place underwater, there were barnacles, flinging at the screen that, and certain light beams that were stretching beyond the screen that I was still flickering at the screen because of how good it was. I'm not going to say it's an absolute must to watch this movie in 3D, but if you do go see it in 3D, I don't think you're gonna regret it. Now, even though this movie exceeds on all levels when it comes to its visuals and its action sequences and its overall fun factor, all of its negatives are found in its script. The script is pretty basic, but that's not one of the bad things about it. What's bad about it is the fact that there's, turns that it takes where it becomes either generic or cliche. There's characters in this movie that are types, you've seen them before in other science fiction or alien or monster movies. You got our main character whose name I think was Riley. I might be wrong about that. He's played by Charlie Hunnam, who's from Sons of Anarchy. I don't watch Sons of Anarchy, I just, IMDb. And he's good in the movie, but his character is, Maverick from Top Gun. The difference here, though, is that he's not as cocky, so he's a little more likable. Which I found kind of funny because literally at the beginning of the movie, somebody tells him, don't be cocky. I was like, hey, he listened. You got the hard-nosed marshal, you got the guy who instantly gives him the dead eye when he walks in and says, you don't belong here. You got the geeky guy who figures out everything that is scientific about the movie. And even some of the characters were just a bit too cartoony. Which I know is a bit of a stretch considering that this is a movie about giant monsters versus giant robots, but they were cartoony to the point where they managed to stand out. There's a character, I can't remember his name, but he's a scientist and he works against Charlie Day's character, who's the geeky, nerdy guy, and he talks with the British accent, and he talks like this, shivering back and forth like, whoa. He was just so over the top that even though all the other characters are types, they weren't overdoing it like that. So when I saw him, I'm like, just get him out of the movie. I didn't hate him, but I just didn't want to see him in the movie anymore because he stood out like a sore thumb. And there's another character who doesn't act that way, but he looks that way because of the fact that he just looks so, pimped out, I guess. I don't know, but Ron Perlman's character, I believe his last name was Chow. I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Chow, and his performance-wise, Ron Perlman is great, and you can tell that he's having fun being on the set of a giant robot monster movie and having fun reuniting with Guillermo del Toro after working on the Hellboy movies. But it's almost like Del Toro saw the Hunger Games and said, you know what, I want a character dressed up like that. And like I said before, sometimes the story would take turns in which it gets a little generic and it uses things from other movies that we've seen before within the genre. The movie opens with an action sequence involving our main character Riley and his brother. Let's just say that being the brother of the protagonist in a science fiction monsters versus aliens movie typically sucks. And then later on, Charlie Day's character discovers a particular plot element that, when I saw this plot element, I'm like, no. It's Godzilla all over again. 1998 Godzilla. Unfortunately, it doesn't go anywhere, but when it does happen, and thinking back to it, I'm like, that was a bit of a convenience for the plot, not so much an actual plot device that could have made this a lot more clever and a lot more fleshed out. But that's more of me nitpicking at this point. But I will say that another thing that I did find a complaint in is that the plot barely starts to get a little more convoluted for its own good. It starts off pretty simple. I mean, I'm not gonna go into detail, but they show how these monsters are invading Earth, and they show what needs to be done in order to be able to stop this invasion. And I'm like, okay, cool, that sounds very straight and narrow, I could go with this. But then once again, Charlie Day's character discovers something later on that makes me go, oh no, don't do this, don't get way over your head. Fortunately, it stops just shy of that, so I could give that movie credit for knowing, when it could get a little too complicated and stopping just right before that. Overall, this is a definitive movie to go see during the summertime. This is an excellent blockbuster. It's very fun, and to make matters even better, it speaks to the inner kid inside of you and just makes you reminisce of the good old times, simpler times, when all you would do is just play around with the toys and have an overall good, fun time without having to check in your brain at the door. But that's not necessarily saying that this movie is going to make any top 10 lists by the end of the year. I give Pacific Rim an 8.3 out of 10, which is a B. I still recommend that you go see Pacific Rim, and if you do, don't be so quick to steer away from seeing it in 3D. And on a side note, if you do go see it, be sure to stay for a mid-credit scene. It's not at the very end, but it's like right in the middle like they did with the Avengers. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.